Today is Thursday, August the 31st. Tomorrow is September 1st. Hard to believe. So this is our Indigent Defense Commission meeting. We're starting up at 2:12 officially. And let's go around and I'll say your name from the screen here in the room. I'm in person at IDC, or the Utah Office of Indigent Defense. And why don't you this time say your name, your position, and then for commissioners, what discipline you're representing on this commission in the law. Let's start with Amber, I guess.
My name is Amber Lichty, and I am the training coordinator here at IDC.
Yes, thank you. And I'm next, Lorene Kamalu, commissioner, and I represent one of the appointments by the Utah Association of Counties. Let's go around this room here first. Go ahead, Matt.
Matt Barraza, the executive director of the IDC.
Kadi Sandy, master's student at Southern Utah University.
Thank you.
Leslie Howitt, data analyst for the IDC.
Adam Kirk, assistant director for IDC.
Great. Okay, back up to the screen. Michael Drexel.
Michael Drexel from the Administrative Office of the Courts.
Thank you. Judge Zimmerman.
Michael Zimmerman, former justice, and that's the designated job position I fill.
Yeah. Thanks. Margaret.
Margaret Lindsay, Utah County Public Defender Association, child welfare position.
Yes. Wally.
Wally Bugden, I'm a defense lawyer representing reasonable doubt.
Ah. I'll have to think about that. So that's one of those times you guys throw around terms thinking we all know what it means. Okay, Senator.
Todd Weiler, concerned citizen.
God, so funny. He's a senator, a state senator. We all know that. Okay, John.
John Quorum, and I want to be sensitive to, I guess, what I title myself. What would be the best title? Diversity and, I guess, inclusion.
Well, you're the representative from the Utah Minority Bar Association officially.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then that is what I am.
It's one of the things that you contain multitudes.
Awesome. Hey, Pam.
Pam Vickery, I am a juvenile defense attorney, and I represent I'm the juvenile delinquency side of the juvenile delinquency.
Yes. Very good. Okay, Ryan.
Ryan Lewis, appointed by the Utah League of Cities and Towns, or representing them.
Yes. And Commissioner Hopes.
Casey Hopes, and I'm late. I apologize. You were probably waiting on me. Sorry.
Oh, no, we didn't have to. Another Utah Association of Counties appointee. Casey's in for the counties of 3rd through 6th.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, Carbon County, right? Yes. Yeah, good to see you, Casey. Okay, let's see. Ken, you're next. Oh, you're muted. Uh-oh. You may not have your audio. Sorry.
It's all right.
That's okay.
We know who Ken is. Ken is the assistant director of CCJJ.
Terrific. Great. And executive director of CCJJ is coming. He's en route. So he'll join in and we'll see him in a minute. Okay, and then let's see, Mary.
Hello, Mary Corporon. I am a defense attorney in private practice and apparently have real low bandwidth right now, so I'm making do, but attorney in private practice, and I believe I've been appointed through suggestion from the Utah Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers.
Okay, terrific. Yeah,
And I want to clarify, Mary's talking about her Wi-Fi bandwidth, not her intellectual bandwidth, so.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. No, we know Mary's a thinker. Okay. Very good. Well, thanks, everyone. So we'll go down the agenda and this is pretty exciting. This is something that the commission decided it would be a really good idea to do. And so we have Leslie Howitt and Katie, how do you say it again? Kadi will present on all their work with the compensation study.
Right to it. Okay, I will share my screen, so bear with me for a minute. It's nice that I can just turn around and see for myself how it looks.
Yeah.
Let's get it there. Excellent. Well, as Lorraine said, I'm Leslie Howard. I know all of you by now, but this is Kadi Sandy, who has been our summer master student she is doing master's in public administration at SUU. And it has been absolutely phenomenal to have her working for us this summer. And so this is a project we worked on wholly together. I did most of the data analysis and you did a huge chunk of the research, talking to other states commissions, understanding the lay of the land. So we will be doing this presentation together. And as we proceed through in the first part, feel free to interrupt us, ask questions. But once we get into the recommendations, there will be 4 recommendations. And I'm going to go through all of those. And I've got a final slide that talks about all 4. And that's when we'll transition back into questions. But that way you won't be asking me questions that might be on the next slide, etc.
Okay.
So hopping right into it. Why are we looking into compensation? As you all know, we have had years of attorneys asking for compensation increases as part of our grants. And every year we say, sorry, we can't do that yet. We need to come up with a way to do it fairly. So now is the time. In February 2023, the legislature approved raises for the Attorney General's office. And in response, in April, Salt Lake County approved similar raises for the Salt Lake County District Attorney, for LDA and for GJDA. And so that's another reason it's a good time to look back into this. And then finally, in 2015, the Sixth Amendment Center did their big report that led to the creation of the IDC. In that report, they had only 2 recommendations. One of those recommendations was to create the IDC, and the second was to get rid of contracts that create financial disincentives for attorneys to provide zealous defense, such as flat fee contracts. In the follow-up, the 2015 report from the Utah Judicial Council, they recommended that discussion and a plan for how to get rid of such contracts should fall to the commission they were going to create, which again is us. So, turning it over.
Right, so there are numerous drawbacks to flat fee contracts, and there have been just numerous sources that have brought up what the issues are. So one of them is the Brennan Center report, and one of the main issues with flat fee contracts is there's a conflict between the attorney's financial interests and then the interests of the defendant. Generally, it puts them in a financial situation where the attorney just isn't making like a lot of money on the flat fee contract. And so there's that disincentive to put a lot of work into these cases when they're not going to make any additional money on it. And then there's no way to ensure equitable compensation because, you know, attorneys are working different amounts of hours for the same type of pay. And so there's just like a lot of drawbacks there. And as a best practice, the American Bar Association in the 2002 version of the principles recommended that there would be parity between the defense counsel and the prosecution with respect to resources. And so what does parity with the prosecutor's office look like? That extends to, you know, resources like overhead, access to support staff, paralegals, investigators, because generally with the public defenders, a lot of times they don't have any support staff. So they're doing that all on their own, whereas, you know, the prosecutor does have staff on hand to help them get through cases and things like that. And then there's, you know, just resources that come along with salaried positions that don't generally extend to contract offenders, like health insurance, retirement, FICA tax, all those types of benefits. And so when contractors are compensated, all of that should be included in there to account for those costs that salaried prosecutors generally have covered. So what we did was we went and looked at what other states are doing to kind of learn from them, especially ones that have moved away from the flat fee contract model. And so there's numerous states that are in the process of transitioning. South Dakota is one that banned flat fees in 2000. Nevada banned them in 2015. And then we'll go into what Idaho and Michigan did because they are the ones that are moving most recently away from the model. And so Idaho was one that we actually got to talk to directly. And it was really interesting because the Sixth Amendment Center actually wrote that they banned flat fees in their statute. And so we reached out to Idaho because we figured that was a really good place to start. And then as we were going into it, we realized that Idaho is actually in the process of overhauling their system completely. And so they're moving away from this contract model where the counties are providing the services and they're moving to a statewide centralized model. And so they do have, you know, in statute where that's banned, that they're not supposed to have flat fees, although it's kind of an interesting one because it's not technically banned there. It's just that all of the expenses can't come out of the attorney's fees. Like there has to be a separation, or you have to, you can negotiate to have those expenses included, but you can't have like the pot covering all of the trial expenses in Idaho. And then they also have a statute that establishes pay parity between county prosecutors and public defenders. So again, that kind of goes back to what the American Bar Association kind of recommended in terms of parity between the two. So now they are currently in the process of overhauling their entire system over the past 2 legislative sessions. And now the state's going to take over. They're going to have an entire office for like the state public defender. And I think last month they started that process. So like they're literally in the middle of it. And it's going to roll out in October 2024. And because of that, they don't really know what the standard rate will be because they want to have a statewide rate for the public defender so that there's more consistency. But they did mention a lot that they talked to Colorado when they were doing kind of like their research and things. And so I know as of 2021, Colorado's rate was around $80. So I'm sure that's adjusted since then. But I would guess based off of how much they referenced Colorado in our conversation, that it might be around that range. But it's so new that they don't really have the numbers yet, so. Okay, and then we were also able to talk to Michigan, and in October 2022, Michigan had a new standard go into effect to minimize the disincentives that, you know, the Sixth Amendment Center pointed out between public defenders and then the defendants. And so with this standard, they implemented like hourly compensation rates, and that they're taking federal rates and appellate rates into consideration. And so that's how they got the misdemeanor, non-life offense, and life offense felony rates. They just, and there's a formula that goes along with it, but yeah, that's generally what they decided on. And they adjust those they adjust those yearly based off COLAs that the state employees have. So they'll see adjustments every year. And this was one where they've slowly rolled this model out over 5 years to decrease the budget ask because it is a pretty big budget ask. Based off of what was in the budget documents for them, it looks like it increased their year-over-year spending by like, I think the ask was like 70 million, but theirs is a complete, yeah, it's 70 million for that, but Utah definitely on that level. And then they did say that if Utah has the authority to mandate an hourly rate, then that's the way to go. But again, that was just my recommendation.
So what does this current compensation look like in Utah? In Utah, over 100 attorneys have flat fee contracts. This actually breaks down into more than 100 contracts because many of those attorneys have multiple contracts in different counties or in different court areas. Additionally, there are around 140 salaried attorneys. These are mostly in the large counties. Salt Lake County makes up the vast majority of that, with Utah not far behind. And then there are now some after the last couple of years in Weaver, plus the 3 managing defenders in Davis, Cache, and Uinta. In general, contract attorneys are not asked to track their time, though the IDC, me, asks them to estimate their weekly time 2 times a year. These are not robust estimates. You know, this is somebody on whatever day they decide to fill out the survey going, how many hours do I work a week on this? But they're the best guesses we have. And so with the information gleaned from that survey, I was able to estimate that attorneys are paid about $56 an hour on average, but there is a huge discrepancy. I know at least one attorney is paid $176 an hour, and that was one where I had lots of conversations with this attorney. So that one is a robust hour estimate. And then some attorneys are paid as little as $16 an hour when you break it down. And this is all across the board. In general, we'll get into it, but these lines represent what we will be recommending as some of these hourly rates. And you can see each of these circles as an attorney. The vast majority of attorneys are under that line. They are making $60 an hour or less. It's really concentrated down there. So back to what I introduced in that first slide about the Attorney General raises and how they led to the Salt Lake County raises. In the 2023 legislative session, there was a new pay scale created for the AG's office, which was a minimum of $54 an hour for brand new attorneys, and up to $84 per hour, and that's salary. And so that's going from $112,000 a year to $175,000 a year, approximately.
Hey, Leslie,
Yes.
can I just interject to say the senior attorney line,
Yes.
it doesn't apply to our parity of pay. Like the senior attorney is what the DA's office refers to as their elected official positions or appointed positions.
Okay.
So in our pay ranges for parity between my office and Rich's, we got the attorney 1, attorney 2, and attorney 3, and then we're cut off. So like we would never get to 175. I think it'll top out at 164.
That's very good to know and might affect when I present the recommendations on the next page. Yes, we should definitely take that into account. Thank you. Ooh, sorry, our building just shook. It's fine. Everything's fine. So that is all salary. In order to convert this to compensation, because that's what contractors need to be thinking about. For the average state employee, salary makes up 70% of their compensation, while benefits make up 30%. And so that's the math I'll be using to calculate compensation throughout all of this. Essentially, it means I'm multiplying salary by 1.42 to get compensation, if you want to really do the math. But what that's equivalent to is somewhere between 77 and 120 per hour in total compensation. Although, as Pam just said, that top number might actually be lower, depending on what we decide to do. So this table has that breakdown of what that looks like for each of these. So for the AG pay scale, they have many, many levels that breaks it down. Essentially, every 3 years of experience gets a pay bump. When Salt Lake County chose to match that, they broke that into 4 categories, which is attorney 1 is 0 to 3 years, attorney 2 is 3 to 8 years of experience, and attorney 3 is 8+ years of experience. And then senior attorney, which as Pam just said, is actually not applied to defenders, but is those appointed positions. Any more questions on this slide before I move on? So now we hop into the recommendation. So after this slide, I'm going to or starting with the slide, I'm going to have you hold your questions so that I can run through all 4 of the recommendations, and then we'll talk about them all together. So our first recommendation is to come up with an hourly rate. But But first, instead of compensating based on experience, as Salt Lake County and the state has done, to instead base compensation on case or contract type. This is because with 100 attorneys out there to keep track of, it will be very hard for us to constantly keep track of how many years of experience everybody has. And it's much easier to just say, this is the rate for a justice court contract, this is the rate for a district court juvenile delinquency or parental defense contract, and then this is the rate for complex felonies. So complex felonies would be minimum mandatory sentence cases and murder cases, along with serious youth offender cases, which are those cases that get transferred to adult court or have similar levels of felonies. So those high level sex and homicide and murder cases. Our recommendation is based on the average amount for attorney 1, 2, and then senior attorney is the way we did it. So assuming that in justice court, that's where you're more likely to have those less experienced attorneys. And so they would get the middle of that attorney 1 range at $78 per hour in compensation, which works out to $162,000 a year if they work full time. And then at the other end, we have those complex felonies and serious youth offender cases. And they would be making $111 an hour, which works out to $230,000 per year if they work full time. I will note for context, right now we have 4 complex contracts currently in existence, 2 in Davis County and 2 in Weber County, and those contracts are currently making $125 per hour. And then in general across the state, when there are hourly rates for, which is usually for conflicts, those hourly rates really vary, and they are frequently 75, but frequently 90. Grand got backed into doing 125 because they were really desperate. So that's kind of the big context for where these numbers sit. Moving on. Cost estimate. So right now, for those 100 attorneys and their 150 contracts, those contracts cost $8.9 million. 2.7 million of that comes from IDC grants. I should say grants, not contracts. That is a typo. So that means 73% of that is coming from local spending and 27% of that is coming from IDC grants. For these 100 attorneys, 150 contracts, we estimate that we will need an additional $5.9 million per year. This is based on those semi-annual surveys of time. So saying, okay, if they said they worked this many hours a week, and this many hours a year, and we're going to pay them at this rate, we need this much more funding. This estimate does not include Carbon, Wasatch, San Juan, Emory, Paiute, Garfield, Summit, or Duchesne counties. It does not include Carbon because Carbon. Sorry, we just have some issues. This doesn't include. Maybe it's just an echo, but I don't have sound on. Oh well, we're gonna power through. It does not include Carbon. Because Carbon just restructured, they regionalized between their cities and their counties, which is amazing, but it means that I don't have up-to-date data on them yet. Same with Wasatch, their new our grant program, and
Yeah, exactly.
And then
Just stay in
the
bed,
last
but
Mary,
cool.
Mary, if you can hear, mute your phone, please.
And then the other 6 counties are not grant participants, so we don't have data on them. But if you read the report, you'll note that I said between those counties, we think there are fewer than 20 attorneys. So they're not going to add a ton to the costs, no matter what their numbers are. Cost estimate for salaried positions. So the current IDC funding for salaried positions is 2.6 million, and the current system funding from their counties is over 25 million, and it might be even more based on increases from Salt Lake County and possible increases from Utah County. But even for those positions, we estimate that we'd need a $2.2 million increase $1.8 million for Utah County, although some of that is contingent on county negotiations, and then about $400,000 for the Weaver County salaried positions. So our second recommendation, along with what Michigan has done, is that we think annual increases in compensation should be equivalent to the COLAs that state employees get every year, and the entire pay scale would go up. So whether you were a brand new level 1 or justice court attorney, or you started 4 years ago, your pay is going to be that same level. That entire level will go up with the COLA every year. And then every 2 years, we would ensure that the pay scale remains equivalent to the AG's pay scale. So we can retain parity in that level. Recommendation 3, time tracking. This entire model will require time tracking, which has not been done in the state very often. It would, in other states, they track by case. So at the end of a case, you invoice for all the hours spent on a case and then get paid. We think it would be much easier, both for attorneys and for the administrators who are dealing with this, to only track total time spent in court and total time spent out of court in a day. So if you were staying in court for 3 hours, it would be 3, and then if you continued to work for 5 hours on your cases outside of court, it would be 5 to get you to 8 hours. This is not hours billable. This is actually hours worked. So the same as we have as state employees, and I'm sitting in my office, you know, I'm not just clicking on whenever I'm writing an email. It's the whole day that you're sitting down to do this work. And so when you're thinking about that hourly rate, also think it's okay if that hourly rate is lower than an hour's billable rate, because it's going to be more hours, which we can get into. But our recommendation would be that this is submitted to the manager every 2 weeks, again, just like we do with state employees, and the manager would do spot checks for reasonableness. And the IDC can provide tools to help with this. I know attorneys' caseloads, and so we can provide, you know, an estimate of like, this person has a really high caseload, they should be working approximately full-time on this. And so if you see them submitting 10 hours every week, that's a good feedback system to start checking in with that attorney and saying, hey, these cases are taking a lot less time than I think they should take. Do you need training on how to do these? Why are they taking such little time? Maybe it's a good thing, maybe you're like a speed reader. And then similarly, if they're taking too much time, it creates that same feedback loop and really helps with management. And then the manager would submit total hours to the county monthly or quarterly, which would match the current pay schedule. So this should not add work for the county administrators either, because they would be cutting checks on that same schedule. They get a very easy list of hours and the rates, and so they should be able to do that fairly easily. Fourth, there's a lot of checks on this slide, but it's pretty simple. We recommend that we would implement this in a 3-phase approach, with each phase taking 2 grant cycles. The first phase would be completely opt-in. So all those attorneys who have asked us for pay increases all these years, this would be their opportunity to get those compensation increases. They would opt in, it would be this hourly model. It would help us get some kinks out, possibly including what the hourly rate should be, but definitely including how time tracking would work, things like that. I would estimate about 40 attorneys would opt into this based on how many have asked for compensation increases in the past year or past couple of years. And so that would run for 2 grant cycles. Once we get to phase 2, we would hope that more attorneys will opt in because they will see the compensation increases that their colleagues get. But then we would also work with systems and counties who would like to opt into this and would like to require hourly compensation, so they really have a better understanding of what they're paying for, and to get more of that fairness and the accountability. And then moving into phase 3, which would be grant cycles 5 and 6, we will require all counties accepting IDC grants to pay their attorneys hourly instead of using flat fees. And the IDC rates will be a required minimum. If counties want to pay more than the minimum, they're more than welcome to, but that minimum will be what we are working hard to get funding to bring everyone up to. So that was all 4. So hit me with your questions, thoughts, everything.
Thank you. Welcome, Tom. I see Tom Ross is with us.
Yes, hopefully you got my text.
Yes, yeah,
It
we
is,
said that in the beginning. No problem.
and I probably wouldn't be the first one to start asking questions because I know I missed like the first 15 minutes, but yeah, I do appreciate the work that's gone into this and the research. At some point, and maybe it's not now, but some point in this conversation, I can probably give a little bit of an update on what the governor's office is telling us about the budget. As Matt, all of our agencies tied to CCJJ, we had met a few weeks back to prepare for our budget submissions. And then the governor had a meeting shortly after that. And I think there's some changes coming out of that could impact all of us. And potentially this, not knowing exactly where the funding requests are going to be for this. But anyway, well, that may not be the right time to talk about that now, but it might be helpful.
This is excuse me, this is Wally. I'm just wondering, Pam and Margaret, for example, how difficult would it be, I mean, realistically for managers, and it wouldn't really be the two of you, would be your managers below you, I suppose, but to supervise and to determine whether or not your attorneys are honestly reporting their hours. I mean, I suppose it's true in private practice. Are lawyers honestly reporting the amount of time that they devote to a case? But these models definitely require tracking the hours. And I don't know to what extent supervisors have the ability to really ascertain if their attorneys are honestly reporting how much time is really being devoted, both in court, out of court. What do you guys, could you guys share some insight on that?
So I'll interrupt for just a second before, although I would love to hear from Commissioners Vickery and Lindsay. Their offices would fall under the salary groups. And so those offices would not need to track hours because the assumption is that they are full-time attorneys, as the assumption is now.
Okay, I'm sorry that I misunderstood that, but so then that would fall to any of our offices where they're managing directors. Is that right?
Well, it would fall to me, Wally, Leslie, Margaret. It would fall to Margaret for all of my contract or conflict attorneys in Utah County, as well as all of the attorneys in Wasatch, Millard, and Juab counties.
Yes, good point.
So, we still would be looking at approximately, for me, just as it currently exists, with the 6th judge coming on in a month or so, I'll have 12 conflict attorneys in Utah County, and then you add approximately another 6 or 7 attorneys for the other 3 counties. So that's about.
Well, other than it's somehow coming to your attention that someone's not honestly reporting, how would you really ever know?
All I could do is be looking at probably the care calendars, be in court, looking at, our own files to see who's appointed on what and see what the comparative workload appears for one parent as opposed to, the other attorney who's representing another parent. It will be a huge endeavor. I mean, if I can see the importance of it, but it will be a big task.
Hey, can I just chime in? I think in a lot of ways, Wally, like with my office, we're already doing that. I mean, like Leslie says, they've always been salaried, so it's always been a little different. But I've always had the attorneys time track. The county, Salt Lake County's always required us to do that. So we've been doing it for the whole 23 years that I've been doing stuff. But what I do when we're doing employee evaluations is we pull their time tracking and see like how many they're averaging per week and stuff like that. But I think it's and then we've also come up like in working with Matt and Leslie with like kind of like for certain type dealing after the RAND assessment that they did about like how long cases should take and stuff. I met with Leslie and Matt again, and we kind of went through and we were like, well, how long should cases really be taking you? So I think what you do is you meet with your attorneys and look and pull kind of some cases to see like if they're really out of whack or like from where you expect, and then kind of just talk with the attorney about why were there more hours or not. And so I think it really actually incorporates what is good supervision stuff, which is really you're meeting with the attorney, not so much about how much time they're spending, but also in what capacity they're spending the time. Like, because the time tracking that I'm assuming, you know, whether you're using FileVine or Defender data, you know, you break it down by category, like time, interview with a client or research or something like that. And so I think then you're just, I think actually you would be pulling their regular hours and looking at it. And so like Margaret said, it's definitely an extra tool, but I don't think once you get used to it, that it would be impossible to do. Because I think it's just something that you work into like your employee evaluations or evaluations with the person, where you look at the hours and then you kind of maybe audit a couple files and see if there's certain things that are super out of whack, or if it looks like, yeah, that seems pretty reasonable. We know a transfer case typically should take about this many hours, you know, some stuff like that.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Commissioner.
Yeah, Commissioner Hopes.
Well, I've got a lot of questions. And I don't, again, I'm new to this, so please bear with me. One of the questions I had is looking at this, you're breaking it out between justice court, district court, complex felonies, and I understand the reasoning behind that. But in a county like mine, where all of the attorneys are of a similar age, they have similar experience, they've all done felony cases because they've worked for different cities, they've done, but now you're gonna, what it will feel like to them is you're only a justice court, so we're only gonna pay you this, but that's, we hire every attorney in the county. And so now you're gonna subject one to a lesser pay because he's gonna handle the misdemeanors in the justice courts, and the other one will get felony, complex felony rates, which they have same experience, they have same, how do you work that out in a county like mine where we employ everybody and there's really nobody beating down the door to come here and work the other cases?
Thank you.
In Carbon County, at the moment, like you said, there's just a big reorganization. And so a lot of the attorneys are covering both. And so, I mean, what we should discuss is whether those contracts should be split up. And so it's essentially 5 attorneys would get paid a certain rate for their justice work and a different rate for the district work is one option. But there is also a justice court defender that is just justice court alone. And I do believe currently they are getting paid a lower rate for those cases. So the current situation already leans this way. But I can understand what you're saying, that people might not be happy with that in the future once all of this is standardized. So I would love to hear everyone's thoughts. I will say, in general, that justice court rate of $78 per hour is still more money than almost any attorney is making right now. So even if they're getting paid a lower rate, they're still going to be paid a higher rate than they currently are making. But I would love to hear input on Commissioner Hope's question.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone have anything specific to what Commissioner Hopes just brought up? If not, Judge Zimmerman has his hand up. You want to say something, Michael? Oh, can't hear you. Go ahead and unmute.
You don't need to hear my dog. I remember when we did the task force initially, we started out with the appeals, and one of the phenomena we noticed was there were flat rate contracts for appeals. $700 was kind of a standard. And the result was a number of them were done really poorly, defaulted. So there was really very little effective appellate representation. So I always came away from that study thinking that the flat fee contracts, plus the fact that, there are situations where firms were piling up all these flat fee contracts in a way that it didn't look possible that they could be providing adequate legal services because one county didn't know much about what happening in the other county or the other court. And I'm just my question really goes to those of you that are more familiar with the trial court practice. Does this phenomena of getting money and then not actually providing the services at the level, is that really is it manifest in the trial courts the way it did in the appellate courts in the rural areas? Because that's a premise of this.
Well, I will say that kind of along those lines of the things that you saw when you were looking at the appellate contracts, we do see certain people who have collected so many different contracts that there is just no way under the sun that they are providing the kind of representation with the number of cases that they're juggling. And so I think that that is reflected. I wouldn't paint the whole state as having that problem, but there definitely are some hot spots. And to Leslie's point too, a lot of the information that we do have is collected twice a year, and so we do have some questions about the accuracy of that data. And I think that if the contract holders were required to report their time spent on a more frequent basis, I think we would get a lot better, more accurate pictures to the amount of time being spent.
And this would then flush out anybody who was reporting that they were working, 400 hours a month.
Right.
To different courts in different counties.
It would be very obvious very quickly, I think.
Yeah.
What was going on.
This isn't just meant to penalize people who aren't working that many hours. There are plenty of attorneys who work a ton of hours on their case and their contracts aren't currently set up to compensate them for that. Like we were just talking to parental defenders down in Iron County who were like, I worked all weekend on this case that went to trial and there's nothing in my contract that compensates me at all for all this work. Like I could do nothing and be paid the same amount, right?
I think that's definitely a challenge in the juvenile court realm. Leslie, I think we have more of the issue of them not being fairly compensated rather than the opposite, although there may be a few instances where what Matt said is true. Yeah.
No, it's just it would be more accountability on both sides. People would get paid for what they're doing and they wouldn't be getting paid for what they aren't doing.
Right, or an assessment, a fair assessment of we think your time is worth more. To me, that's how I'm looking at it. We believe that your time is worth more than you're currently being compensated for. But in order to implement that, this is what we need from you in return. That's how I'm looking. But to me, the question is, where's this $5.9 million going to come from? I look, for example, at Utah County, which just this week matched what the AG's office in Salt Lake had done and what had previously been matched for our county attorney's office. So they came up big to match our office. But, the thought of going in and saying, oh, by the way, we needed an additional, $1 million. what, or whatever the number is, you know, it's gonna be hard.
I mean, I think one advantage of doing it in this phased approach is in this first year and the second year, we will have a much better understanding of where these numbers lie. Because right now, I'm guessing based on hours that are extremely estimated. And so my estimate could be an overestimate, it could be an underestimate. So we don't even completely know exactly what we need yet.
And with those phases, what we would be doing with our budget requests is breaking that $6 million up into chunks. And so for the first phase, we would ask for a $2 million appropriation to be able to do this. We would have to cap, and you know, if everybody wanted in on it immediately, that would be a tricky situation, but we would need to put a cap on that and monitor that really closely. But then, as Leslie said, then we would be able to have some really great data as to what the final cost would be, and we could adjust accordingly.
Casey, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say along that same line, in recommendation 4, it says that the counties would continue to pay the same rate. And then have to spend through the money first, then the IDC provides additional funding with a cap. But what happens if you get to November and there's been more billing? Then how do you get through the other months if there's no more funding left? Did the counties end up picking up that tab?
I think that's just where we backed ourselves back into the flat fee. So we've essentially, if you're working on a calendar year, you've had 11 months in which they were able to get compensated hourly, which is better. And for that 12th month, unfortunately, we're back into the flat fee system, where the benefit of doing this, even with a cap, is for those 11 months and for the whole year, then they were compensated much higher than they were before the cap was added. But it is good.
Can you talk about the cap? I think
Okay.
maybe that was might have been lost in the presentation.
Yes.
So.
So the idea of the cap would be, so let's start with a justice court attorney. There's a justice court attorney who is currently being paid, a fairly common number would be 80,000. So their current compensation is $80,000 a year. And we are guessing they're working full time. And so the way the cap would work is that we would have a cap at this compensation number we set, so 162,000. So your county, let's say Carbon, would continue to put in 80,000, and then the IDC would put in another maximum of $82,000 a year. And so that would be broken down into quarters, just the way all of our grants are now. And so in that first quarter, Carbon would put in 20,000 and the IDC would put in 20 point whatever thousand. And the attorney would work through all of those hours. So if they do happen to go over those hours, we would hit that cap each quarter. And it is a bummer to hit the cap. But like I said, they're already getting paid an additional $80,000 to what they're used to. So at least for these couple first years, we're testing it out and we're just trying to understand what the hourly rates are. Hopefully they won't be too distraught when they hit these caps.
Yeah, that's helpful explanation.
Thank you.
Or would it make more sense to, at least as we're ramping up, if we don't have all really and we don't think it's reasonable to expect to be able to get all the funding, are we better off just increasing the contracts amount and start demanding these time tracking and everything and then transition to an hourly rate as we increase our funding base?
I think it was always really hard for us to figure out how to increase the contracts by any amount, because it was hard to tell which attorneys were severely underpaid, which ones were making maybe an average amount, and which ones were making too much, because we don't know the hourly. And so that's the reason you as a commission have always declined compensation increases in the past, where we just don't know who to give them to and how without switching to an hourly model. But it is with how much money we have, we can do that math to say, listen, we think you should be getting paid this rate, and we will pay you that rate up to a cap and make that cap way lower. Like instead of the cap being 80,000 under, or an additional 80,000 from the IDC, the cap would be an additional 40,000 from the IDC, which is still a lower hourly rate than we think they should be getting, but it represents a $40,000 increase. So that would let us balance that while we're working to get our funding, is one option for how we.
While we're working to get our funding and the accurate hours that people are working.
Yes, both of those. But I also think in the first phase, and unless all of these counties are all in, which would be incredible, but seems moderately unlikely that everyone can get everybody to time track in the first year. Our first year is going to be very small. I think there's the $2 million for the first year, if we can get it, I think is very likely to keep our bases covered for that first year.
Michael Drexel.
Oh, interesting. A few observations. One, I wonder if there's a possible diminishment of certain attorney involvement in cases with an hourly model that's being scrutinized by a manager. And let me give some detail to why I think that might be. When I had a parental defense contract in Vernal for 3 years in the juvenile court, and I went to every single family team meeting through the life of every case for every single client, every single time, right? Even when cases were going well, I went. And I could see places around the state where if an attorney submits a time track that says, hey, I was going to family team meetings, that somebody says to them, well, you shouldn't be going to those. That's not a good use of attorney time. And so suddenly the attorney's saying, well, I guess I'm not going to be going to those anymore if I'm going to get pushback on billing for it. So just an observation. I don't know if there's something to that or not. I know that it would be frustrating for me if I had been in that situation to have people feeling like they didn't want to compensate me for doing that work. Then secondly, I think most prosecutors in the state that work in county attorney's office are basically getting paid a flat fee contract to do their work, right? Cases come in and they do the work. How many ever cases there are, they find a way to make it work. Now, there are benefits and all sorts of other resources, and I think compensating defense attorneys to have those same sort of resources available to them is probably more critical, actually, than their hourly pay, maybe. But why would we treat individual defense attorneys differently than prosecutors in this important regard? In other words, we're saying you be an independent contractor, but you're going to bill hourly because we want to try and mirror what prosecutors are doing, but then prosecutors aren't doing that at all. They're getting paid a flat fee salary. And then thirdly, an observation, there are municipal prosecutors around the state that will continue to have flat fee contracts for doing the prosecution work in many of these same courts that then justice court defense attorneys would be paid on an hourly basis. Again, a differentiation that I don't know if this brings alignment or not, but I like the idea of increasing compensation, but more importantly, I like the idea of increasing it in a way that there's direct accountability to a supervisor in an HR department and the sort of things that prosecutors who work in county attorney's office have going for them in terms of that accountability. So anyway, a few observations. I don't know if I have any answers to those questions though.
Regarding question 2, so that's one that's the most interesting data-wise to me, is this rural county problem of flat fees, because definitely flat fee prosecutors and rural counties love flat fees because their budgets are easy, right? But I've seen predictable. Thank you. There's one rural county that gets some years has 2 cases and some years has 10, and they're paying $14,000 for that contract. And so that means in the years with 2 cases, they are way overpaying for that contract. And even though $14,000, when you're talking about Salt Lake County, is pennies, to that county, that 14,000 definitely be used differently. And then in the heavier years, that attorney should maybe be getting paid more, but it makes a lot of sense for their own budgets and making sure that they're getting what they're paying for, to have it track those cases. At least from my perspective, sitting behind my data chair, I'm not running their budgets, but when I look at those, I'm like, that person's way overpaid for these cases, and then the next year underpaid, so.
Let's see, Wally, I believe you put your hand up next.
My comment was just, of course, I'm thrilled that we're trying to increase compensation for defenders. I think that's great, and going to the hourly model, I think makes perfect sense. But I also completely support the notion of a cap, of having some sort of a cap in place, particularly as we're trying to phase this in. And also, we haven't really talked about or heard, for example, from Tom yet. I guess he'll speak next about the availability of money. But I mean, where there's limited money, I think having a cap makes some sort of sense. And I agree with Michael about having supervision over the hours by supervisors, managing directors, for example, looking at that. And I would just say, as a private lawyer, I generally have worked on the flat fee model, not the hourly model. And the reason I've done that, quite frankly, is the hourly model is just too expensive for most people. The people that I represent and that can afford my representation, if I was billing hourly, they could never afford my fee because of so many hours that are devoted to do a great job for someone. And so the flat fee model for me and for the clients that I represent is a more financially viable model. I can just say as an example, I have a very specific example where I charged a particular fee for representation through a preliminary hearing, and a big firm that was charging by the hour, their fee was 4 times the fee that I charged, where I think I was the lead lawyer, and I know I did more work than the people that were being billed hourly. So a cap, I think, makes perfect sense with our situation where there's limited funds. It's not unreasonable, and the attorneys are going to be better compensated with the hourly model as it is.
Thank you. Okay, Tom.
Yes, it's been a great conversation. And, as far as me personally, I certainly support in the sense that we're trying to make things more fair between what typically could be on a prosecution side and a defense side. And I think there's a lot of what's being talked about and presented that makes sense. It probably would be helpful because even with Matt and our conversations earlier, things have changed since that initial meeting in the follow-up meeting with the governor's office, and this will certainly have an impact on what we're looking to do. And maybe I'll give a little bit of information of what the state governor's office and his economic advisor is telling us going forward. The state is projecting flat revenue and potentially a 3% drop in revenue. They're telling us that because of that, there's going to be heavy scrutiny, more so than in the past, on any ongoing costs, new requests, and even one-time costs will be scrutinized at a heavier level. With that, what they wanted all of the executive directors to understand is if they give an increase to someone somewhere, they're taking it from someone else. It's not likely going to be where we've had for the last several years, even with COVID, which started out as a downturn and there was some pullback and then a lot of federal stimulus, and we had more money coming in than anyone had ever thought possible. That we haven't had a potential year like this for 7 or 8 years. And so that the message going forward is ongoing funding, be expecting to not get it unless you can really justify it. One time, there could be one-time increases that may be necessary, but know that any new funding will come out of someone else's budget. They're heavily scrutinizing the federal funding. The state's budget, about 28% of it is made up of federal funding, which is a sizable amount. If you've been paying attention to some of the interim discussions, social services, law enforcement commission or committee, and I think others, I know it's been broader than that, but those were two that I was there. The state is starting to prepare for, or talking about wanting to prepare for drops in federal funding. So they're telling us that we are going to have to, each agency, which may not be a big issue here, but it is going to be an issue, agencies across the board. We're going to have to give breakdowns of all of our federal funding, what that covers, how critical it is in case the state tends to start moving that direction. Then we could have cuts on the federal side, even if it's not necessarily a pullback. They're starting to prepare for it. So Matt, I think maybe a question for you, and I know that we had this conversation, but I did not have an opportunity to go back and look at that. The funding that we would be requesting for this, I hear the $2 million number. Was that going to be a one-time request for this year, hoping to flip it over to ongoing, or are we coming in with an ongoing request? Refresh my memory.
Yeah, I think we were talking about that being ongoing, or I'm sorry, one-time funding, Tom, because of the uncertainty as to how it would be requested, right? And so I think that's how we had framed that request.
Is it the $2 million at what this would anticipate for this next fiscal budget?
Right. Yeah.
And so coming off of the current fiscal budget, I think we've been going down this path of new funding. We've been doing it on a one-time and then hoping to flip over. What would be the request of ongoing that would be considered new in this next budget?
I believe our one-time funding from last year, which we would ask to convert, was 700. So we would be having that 700 in ongoing that was from last year's one-time funding.
Okay. Now, I think that's helpful. I don't know before Commissioner Kamala, I apologize again that I was late. I don't know, is the intent, you're presenting this for us to chew on and absorb, or were we looking to make some kind of a motion today?
Well, we did want to gather some feedback. We've had a lot of internal conversations, and we've reached out to a few practitioners to get their take on it. But this is the first large group that we've presented this to, and so we wanted to know if there were any blind spots that we were missing. This is not necessarily considered a final product, but given the timeline with the budget request to the governor's office, we did want to have a general sense of if this is the direction that the commission wanted to go as we're moving forward with our budget proposals to the governor and to the legislature.
And I think this commission directed staff to start researching, right? And that was a few months ago.
Yeah, it's a strategic plan.
It's part of the strategic plan. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe another question, if I may. So I think I'm recognizing that and accepting that we've been at a deficit on there's an argument that we've been paying at a deficit on the defense side, and we've been trying to improve that each year. That still exists. Is this $80,000 increase number going to an hourly rate? Is that going to be viewed as, because the number just off the top scares me in the sense of trying to justify if somebody is seeing this as, and one individual is getting $80,000 more of state funding, even though the argument is that they probably should have been getting a portion of that already in the past, and now we're trying to, that it does concern me in the sense of selling that. It is, I think Matt, as you and I have been talking, and this has hit us in other sides, certainly the legal side, the attorneys involved in our agencies, there's been a need and there's been a significant talk about increasing those pay numbers, but they're nowhere near that kind of number. And so that's, I guess, a little bit of my concern is the optics of, we're being told everything is a bad budget year, cutbacks, take from one. If you get one, you're taking from another. If somebody's thinking that we've increased funding by $80,000, even if it's justified in a year like this, I worry about that. Maybe, but yet I still think we need to move forward in a certain way. Does that make sense?
Some of this is, I will not be the one arguing in front of the legislature. I understand there are very specific ways we have to talk about this, but the AG's increase was passed by the legislature was a gigantic increase, even for the AG's office. I believe people were getting raises, full-time employees getting raises on the scale of $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year. So in reality, our raises, if we go through with this plan, would create similar. That 80,000 example is probably extreme. We are probably looking more in that 30,000 range, depending on what hours people work. And that is something the legislature decided was appropriate for prosecutors. I know that might not be an argument that they take to heart, but if you're just looking at this in the most logical way, it seems like it should say, hey, you did this for the prosecutors, we're just asking for the same thing for the defenders. And if anything, we're asking for a lot less money because a lot of this money is already coming from the counties and it doesn't need to be wholly state funded.
Yeah, that was a thought that I had too.
And I don't disagree with that. I think a lot of it will be certainly how it's presented is going to be a factor. The legislature, we saw this happen on the correction side, especially maybe DPS even a little bit. They started their funding increases a year earlier, even than the attorneys were. Last year, the attorneys got big increases. Money was coming in. I think everyone was feeling good. And now everyone's kind of freaking a little bit. So that doesn't mean this argument isn't legit. And I just want to make sure, I guess, the 80,000 number seemed much higher to me than anything that we were talking about in our space as far as an increase, not as far as fairness. But it sounds like that 80,000 isn't really the number. It's much lower.
I think that was just a number that was not grounded in any particular contract. That was just a nice round number that Leslie used to illustrate the cap. But I take your point though, Tom, and I think it will be helpful if we move forward with this as we've structured it to get specific and to be able to point to some specific contracts that we know are being underfunded and say with some of those numbers, this attorney is essentially being paid, $14 an hour for this contract.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I think, Casey, I think you had your hand next.
This conversation that we're having right now speaks to one of my biggest concerns, and that is moving forward. I get at the state's picking up the portion, but it could be similar to, say, dispatch, where at some point the state's going to say, yeah, we're pitching in enough. We need the counties to start pitching in. So every time there's a COLA increase, the counties then end up picking up a portion of that COLA increase, which is fantastic. Those employees deserve it. But in some counties, like in Carbon County, we can't afford to give our county employees COLA increases. We're helping to pay for state COLA increases. And that's just one of my worries is will it always be this way? Or at some point, if the state's budget gets tight enough, do they then push some of this back onto the municipalities and to the cities and say, we're picking up the biggest portion of this, you guys have to help pay more of it? And that really, really concerns me. And I know that's not part of this entirely, but down the road, it could be.
Yeah, and you know, you and I are here to speak up for all of the counties, right? And so, like what you just said, I can see that being said by all of the rural, if not all of the counties. I was even going to say that, even though I represent counties at the first and the second class, there's some really big differences, I think, in the way that defense functions in the first and second class counties. And so the one I'm most familiar with, and even there I'm not all the way familiar, is our model in Davis County. And you might be able to tell me more how this impacts the way that it functions in Davis County, because they're all, except for our managing defender, they are all contracted flat rates, right? And so I'm just trying to wrap my head around, like, I'd be very interested in anyone else's experience with how it works in Davis County. I don't hear that it's problematic. And in fact, I know that Todd Utzinger, who's very well respected, and I respect him as well, he says that they get really good contracted attorneys who do good work. And okay, so I mean, that's I don't hear that there are problems, and so I hear that that's been a model that's been working well for us. And so it sounds like if IDC says we're going to require all of the counties that we work with for grants to leave that sort of a model, I am definitely not sure what that looks like for Davis County. So, yeah, I don't know. And I know, you know, this whole group, I think, talked about the fact that some of the money we've been able to pay to counties, I think Davis County now has 2 of our contracts that are paid for by IDC.
The complex case contracts.
Okay, and and I think that with this upcoming, we have budget meetings, I think all the counties probably do, starting pretty serious here in September and October. There's the budget, big time budget time. And I know that when we, as an IDC said, we were hoping to get more state money so that we can keep some of the contracts going, because there is that much work for them. The work hasn't dropped off, you know, from when trials were not being held, and now the kind of the catch up that we are now, our county is seriously hoping, of course, for that extra money to keep those contracts going.
Those are the ARPA funded contracts.
Yes.
Federal funded temporary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which I think we said as an IDC, we hope to be able to get additional money so that that burden doesn't go back onto the counties. So, yeah, the counties budgets, even, you know, even a county like Davis County, there's always a lot of pressure, and we just can't fund all the things that we know are really good things. So it's like, I can see the concern from Commissioner Hopes, and I think all counties share that concern for sure. So for us, it's like a whole different way of providing indigent defense, and I don't know, because they seem to like it there, the way that it is.
And the Davis attorneys are interesting because a lot of other counties, it's one rate for all of their district attorneys, whereas Davis has many different rates. And so something's going into that.
Yeah.
And so it's possible that there's already this sort of calculation going on when Todd Utzinger hires new defenders.
Yeah, how much? I do think they're individual contracts with there's like, I can't tell you exactly, but I could certainly find out. We all, you know, so could you. Yeah. Let's see, I think that Judge Zimmerman, you were next. I need to unmute.
My question is to Tom. When you say when you say the 700,000 that we got last year, we're looking to renew it. Is that 700,000 in the way you see the budget? Is that sort of up for grabs? So would our ask really be 2.7 rather than just 2? Was that with the eye that the governor's office would look at it with?
So there's two pots of money to look at it this way. You have a one-time request, which the purse string holders tend to feel more comfortable about because they're not committed beyond a year. Even though, just like in our process here at IDC, we're hoping that we can get it to go beyond a year. So you have the one-time funding and you have the request that's for ongoing. The legislature is and the governor's office is going to see the 700,000 as a new request for ongoing funding, even though we've already done it 1 year. And then they'll look at this 2 million and it'll be all that will be one-time funding. So we'll have two buckets that they'll view it in.
And you're saying both, but the 2 million bucket is pretty perilous and the 700,000 is maybe risky too.
They're telling us that the ongoing money will be scrutinized at a level we probably haven't seen in 7 or 8 years. So that's probably the hardest one to move. But the one-time money sometimes can seem like, and certainly if Senator Weiler or someone, he can give much more, but sometimes it can seem like it's not as important. You know, you're asking for one time, maybe you're trying something out, and that certainly isn't the case for everything we've been doing with IDC. It's really been a model built off of getting a piece each year and moving it forward. And when there were new revenues coming in, that's an easier conversation. But you know, Matt, it's just in thinking, I guess where I'm a little bit confused is we will have a state piece that we're going to move forward at some point that's going to ask for funding. Do you have to get the counties or some counties to agree and be able to say that the counties have agreed to this, the state we're asking you, or how do you see that conversation playing out?
Mm-hmm. So again, with the phases, and you might have missed this portion, Tom, but again, with the phases, that takes that into account. So the first phase, which is where this $2 million one-time request would come into play, would be an opt-in voluntary phase. And so it would be, there are some details that we have not really hammered out yet, you know, whether you could have multiple contracts within the same county being, you know, some being flat feed, some being hourly. I think it would need to make sense from a management point of view that all of the contract attorneys within that system would need to opt in order for it to work, because then you would have a managing defender only reviewing, you know, 1 or 2 of his or her 5 attorneys for the hourly submission. So I think practically that makes more sense, but we have not hammered out the details to that level of granularity as far as that first phase. But as far as to your question as to what the counties would have to do for that phase 1, there would be no requirement on the counties as far as changing the way that they go about their business. So it would be more, I think, of a bottom-up approach there for that first phase. It would be if there were enough of the contract attorneys who wanted to switch over to this hourly rate in order to get the increased compensation, then that would be what would be driving it at that point. It would be the later phases, though, as we gather more information and have a better idea of what we're looking at as far as the total expenditure, that we would ask the counties to switch over to the hourly contract. And with these numbers that we're looking at, again, this is from the point of view that the state would be covering the increase in compensation, where there isn't any provision where the county would be required to increase a proportion of their spending towards these contracts.
I will also say in the last year, in this last grant cycle, most counties increased their budgets and many very substantially. So counties have already taken on a lot of the cost of this.
So that's definitely going to need to be a focus of how we strategize this, because I could see if in any way it's an assumptions made by legislators that we are only asking the state for new money to fill a void that's partially been created by all the new funding costs for legal, for attorneys in our state. That might be a pushback, but I guess it sounds to me like what you're trying to do is get a pot of money, whatever that pot ends up being, that the state's willing to accept that we're going to increase compensation in some form. We're trying to do it through a new system, but really at the end of the day, we're trying to increase compensation on the defense side as well. And it could be done in different ways, like you're saying, whether people opt in or not, or maybe counties won't want to do like, maybe Davis, someone may say, no, we like it our way, but so we have a pot of money we're going to ask for. I don't think that unless we decide to change a number, and maybe we don't even now, we have a decision to make here coming up very quickly for the governor's submission. And maybe the budget goes forward with the numbers and a conversation occurs with the lieutenant governor or GOPB before then. I just know that we're going to have to do some work. It's going to be harder, and it's going to be, and we're all going to have to get our minds wrapped around this in a way so that people feel there's parity. It's a shared weight that's being carried, and any new funding, how do we justify that against all the other requests that, that those are going to have to be worked out. But I don't know that we have to work that all out before the budget is submitted.
Okay, well, Tom and Ken, I don't know if the two of you have any time to get together before Tuesday's submission date for the business plan. I know how busy both of you are, but that might be useful just to have take another look at those preliminary numbers that we went through a few weeks ago.
I am leaving. In fact, I was supposed to leave yesterday and the governor pulled me into some stuff. So I'm leaving as soon as this meeting is over to Yellowstone to bring my boat home.
Right.
But I am back Tuesday, and which that wasn't the original plan. I then fly out to Washington to speak at a conference on Wednesday. So I think what you could.
Well, maybe Ken and I can get together and sort through it, and then Ken, I'm presuming that you're around. I don't know if you are or not.
Well, I'll be at least have email access tonight, and then like I said, if maybe you talk with Ken, and then Tuesday, if we could do it early, that would be helpful. Maybe like 8 o'clock-ish, 8:30. We could do a quick run through. Is it Tuesday by end of day submission, or is it, if it's I can't remember the date for having to have it in. I think it.
And is unmuting himself right now.
Unfortunately, his microphone isn't working.
Can you chat,
So we
send
can
that in the
just,
chat maybe?
Gesture.
Okay, Ken just put in it's the 6th, so we should be able to maybe quickly we should be able to look at you can look at it, maybe come up with some ideas, then we can meet. You can talk with Ken in the meantime, and then we should be able to make any adjustments that we need to. But I'm more willing to be a little bit on the bigger side than what this conversation might normally bring, only with the recognition that we're going to have some tough challenges to get that forward. And I'm not completely in my mind clear on how we do that, or if we may have to make some bigger changes, but they'll let us do that probably later as well.
Okay, well, I'm glad we have this scheduled when we did, so that we can have enough time to pivot accordingly as we need to.
Yeah. Pam, you put your hand up.
I was just wondering, when you were doing any of this stuff, Leslie, were you able to tell, like, what's the parity discrepancy in other counties between like I mean, I know, like, we know what it was in Salt Lake because we just went through this in Salt Lake County, but how big of a parity discrepancy between prosecutors and defenders are there? And I know it's hard to tell because in some areas, you know, like the defense contract isn't as many cases, but is there a way to get a sense of that, about the discrepancy between county attorneys and defender rates?
That was a good question. I haven't looked into it.
I mean, I guess the reason I ask that, or I say that, is, and understanding all of the budget challenges, which good luck to Tom, Ken, and Matt, because that sounds fun. But I guess, you know, my thought is, you know, when we were dealing with it in Salt Lake County, you know, I mean, some of what we were looking at was, this was the disparity between the AG and the district attorney's office, and this was the disparity between, you know, that and like my office, right? And so I guess I just would be curious, because you don't, you know, not every prosecutor, or, you know, like, because then you're gonna have the same conversations across the board, right? Like, we were at a meeting and I was talking with a justice court prosecutor, and he was like, oh, we didn't get those pay raises and stuff, right? So like, there's going to be lots of requests that are going to be coming to cities and counties, I assume also for their prosecutors to be coming up to those same pay ranges. But I guess I'm curious, I mean, the discrepancy like between my office and the prosecutor's office was like 50%. And so, I mean, at some point, like, you just can't justify paying people that significantly of a lower rate for the same type of work and the same education and the same qualifications. And so I think I would be very interested in knowing how big those discrepancies are in other areas, at least to be kind of starting about how out of whack are they with other comparable jobs in that market.
Well, and Pam, to your point, where I've heard from people that you're already seeing kind of this upward pull in personnel, right? So in Washington County, the AG's increase has led to people at the DA's office going to the AG's office, and then is leading to people with defense contracts filling those voids at the county attorney's office. And so I think that was a big part of our motivation in tying this all to the AG's raises, is because we're trying to stay one step ahead of that. Because if we just look at the county level county attorney pay rate, that's a moving target right now.
I know our prosecuting attorneys are elected, Troy Rawlings in Davis County. Yeah, he jumped right on the need to increase the pay of prosecutors, and we already had to take care of that, you know, mid-year. And that did happen for us already in prosecution. Our managing defenders, what his pay is definitely right up there by,
Yeah,
he's fine. And then we've got this other different model, which they seem to like there. And the nice thing for the county is that, because, I mean, Leslie pointed it out, benefits is about 30%, you know, and so in Davis County, when we have good attorneys, hopefully doing good work with their cases, and we're not having to pay the benefits, that's That's really nice for us.
Well, and I think that might be part of like, and I know this presentation is different, but it's something to think about, Matt, to your point, and Maureen, like, because that is exactly what highlighted it for salt. And I understand like Commissioner Hope's questions about those things and how you do it, but at some point, like that's what happened with I mean, we're a small office of 8 trial attorneys, right? We have social workers and we have appellate attorneys, but 8 trial workers. And Matt and Adam know this, but like in 1 week's time, we had 3 people leave, like between Monday and Thursday, because they were going and jumping to the higher pay ranges. And so at some point in time, like it became an issue to the county of you're investing all this money in training of these defenders and creating these contracts and just constant turnover where you're losing all, it's really like you're losing money because you're not keeping qualified people to do the work. And so it doesn't become sustainable.
That was Troy Ron's big concern and why we addressed it when we did. Yeah.
It sounds like the selling point in part, Tom, is that the generous raises to the Attorney General's office is fueling this shift across the state of people running away from defense jobs to get onto the state's, pay wagon.
Yeah, this has been much of the debate for several years in the law enforcement side, this robbing of each other, and when the state really raised up the Department of Public Safety, trooper wages and corrections by 30%. And they had to some extent because they're feeling like they're here. Anyone that sits on our commission's boards knows the struggles we're having in corrections and trying to provide staffing. And they told us today that they've been on 12-hour mandatory overtime shifts for 7 years in corrections. That's devastating. So this is the pain of all that, but to the purse string holders, I completely understand where they're coming from too, because yes, you care about all your people and it's all hitting at times, and it's better when the revenues are going up because at least you can tell yourself, we got some new money to pay for it. When revenue's going down, then you start saying, who do I rob to pay this? And that's going to be the challenge this year, possibly. They'll do budget runs going up, but that's what they're projecting. But I do think we need to do something here. I agree. We need to try to improve the parity that sounds like it doesn't exist. But I am worried about if some counties like doing it a different way and they're comfortable and they're not wanting to buy into this, and then others do, and then we raise, I don't know. I guess in my mind, I don't quite understand how this all plays out, but we have some time to work through that. And maybe that will be helpful for all of us to better understand.
Yeah, the one size fits all is sometimes very hard. I mean, that happened with Carbon County. Most of your rural counties, when the state jumped up wages in highway patrol and dispatch, we're losing officers to go become dispatchers because they pay $4 an hour more than an officer does, and they don't have to get shot at.
Yeah.
So the one size fits all sometimes creates a lot of other problems in some areas.
I think Wally asked if Senator Weiler wanted to say anything in the chat. Anyway, and then Margaret, the AG's office, prior to the raise, they were losing attorneys and they were not getting applicants to fill spots. So that's why they did that, huh? Yeah.
It's all driven by a vacuum that we all recognize. It's just hard, when it happens in a lot of different spaces, the purse string holders probably get twisted, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be carrying something forward here and trying to do something, because we have that same obligation. We just got to strategize this pretty carefully.
Yeah.
I don't think the vacuum's unique to this situation. It's across all workforces, whether it's construction to attorneys to whatever it be. There's just not enough people to fill all the vacancies.
Yeah, okay, one last comment, Michael Zimmerman, or was this from your former? You got a hand
No,
up.
this, I have a question here, which is, I guess it's the monster lurking in the closet. Our ambition is to get away from contracts. You know, flat rate contracts. We have looked at, we have up on the study chart 4 or 5 states. How many states are still, if I'm a legislator, I'm going to say, how many states are still using flat rates?
It's a little hard to come up with that question because the Sixth Amendment Center has the best data on that. But like, if you look at their data on us, they're still driving everything off the 2015 report. But we know, at least for our neighbors, New Mexico is hourly, Colorado, everybody's a state employee, Idaho's going to hourly.
Nevada. Did you see Nevada already?
It's Nevada hourly too. Nevada's hourly. You know, I would never bring up New York State in front of legislators, but that's hourly by case. Michigan's going hourly. So even the states where flat fees remain, it has been widely acknowledged they're a terrible idea. They just make budgets predictable.
I mean, the reason I ask is I hear some resistance to changing, getting out of those. And if you pick up a lot of resistance from individual counties about that, that alone could kill the proposal to raise salaries, period, whether they're contract rates or not. And if the real problem right now is flight because of the AG's money, is it more palatable to address that and postpone the contract issue? I mean, I just throw that out as a sense of how do you bargain? What's the most persuasive, you know, like Carbon County, if they like the way they're doing it, Davis County likes the way they're doing it. That's an easy way to sink the $2 million.
It's a good question.
It's
I
worth.
don't go to the legislator, but from a data perspective, I'd say the flight is not my only concern. Like, I do think it's really concerning that counties and cities and us, we don't know what we're paying for. And we don't know how to properly compensate, because the same contract, same money, one of those attorneys is working twice as many hours as the other one. And is that because they're a slower reader, or is it because they are talking to their clients and they're visiting the jails and they're not being compensated for that?
And we have no idea what they're doing.
We don't. You know, our managing defenders, we've put them in place and we've given them tools, and it is so much better than when we didn't have them. But this is such an important tool for them to be able to properly supervise, and it's a tool that they currently don't have.
Okay. All right.
It is,
Yeah.
I think, so to your point, Justice Zimmerman, it is a point of conversation, because I think all of us would really wish that we were going into another year like last year's budget. And there will be traction, I believe, there will be traction about, we've raised all these other attorneys' wages, we've got to do something on the defense side too. We can't leave them out. I think there'll be some traction there. The hard part will be if the counties and the state aren't on the same page, and some feel like you're hurting us. Those conversations could kill the whole thing, or at least muddy it up so much. And I don't think any of us, I certainly wouldn't want to be in front of legislators saying, we don't know how the money's being spent now. I don't think that's helpful at all. But in the same token, if you're asking for a lot more money, and then at the same time you're saying, but we will better understand it and control it, that may or may not be true. I agree that it could be, and it sounds like it. But if I'm a purse string holder, do I care about that as much if I got to pay twice as much money? Or would I rather have it be the lower dollar amount? And nobody should be saying to me that we don't know how we're spending it. So I don't know. It's still, like I said, it may be too much to absorb now. And maybe we go forward, but I think this will be important conversations, and our county partners are going to be important, I think.
Thank you all. It's a lot of good conversation. What are you gonna say, Matt?
I just want to thank Leslie and Khadid for all their time and effort that they put into this. There's just so much information to be gathered and processed, and then be able to distill it down and present it in a way that we can digest. It's just kind of a remarkable feat. So I want to
Really?
thank them for
Yeah.
that first and foremost, and then I want to thank everybody for the thoughtful feedback and important perspectives that you bring to this as well. And so it's only going to improve the final product here, and we will keep you posted for sure.
Yeah, that sounds really good. I echo. I was wondering how in the heck you would even go about in what we tasked you to do as a commission with this topic. So good job. Yeah, lots of good work. Okay, so now we have Matt going to talk about the Washington County grant modification request.
Yes, so let me share my screen.
This is a much smaller number.
I'm gonna find the right tab here. Is this what you're seeing right now?
Yeah, so you're Washington County. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see.
Oh, okay. There we go. Let's see. Okay,
Not yet.
not yet.
There. No, double click that.
And I was just looking at commissioners, looks like we've lost Mary and Ryan, yeah? But I think we still have a quorum.
So go this way. While I'm doing that. Now let's try again. How's that? There we go. All right. So just by way of background, Washington County has made a request to amend their grant award. So they have had an unanticipated increase in demand for defense resources. They're running short, they're running a shortfall from last fiscal year, and then they anticipate an increase this fiscal year for a total amount of $52,000. They are requesting that we, and they have they have been requesting that we take over the funding for their appellate contracts. Specifically, we already do fund a portion of their appellate contracts, but they're requesting that we pay for the full amount. Part of that is the fact that while our IAD, or appellate defense division, handles appeals from rural counties, those are limited to the 3rd through 6th class counties. Washington County is a 2nd class county, but just by a few thousand residents. So that's something that they feel very strongly about. They expressed to us that if they were just a few residents short, then they wouldn't be having to fund these, and that would be part of our appellate program. So they have requested that we pay the remaining or fund the remaining appellate contract amount, which is that $64,000 there that you see, and I've broken that out into the separate contracts. Now, in order to do that without running into supplementation issues, we would have to really cap it at that $52,000 that they're running short. If we were to actually increase the grant award by the requested amount of that $64,000, then we don't have any assurances that that additional money would remain within the defense spending there. So what I have proposed for the commission, and by way of reminder, we have about $37,000 that was not committed at the end of our grant cycle this last for fiscal year 24. When we had that meeting back in June, we granted all the tier 1 through 4 requests, and we did have a small amount of funds that didn't end up being committed to any grants. So that's $37,000. And so what I am recommending is that we grant those funds towards that $52,000, and then we can make up the difference. There is every year when we do have new grant money coming in, there tends to be a gap between when the awards are made and when the counties can actually get those contracts filled. So we should have plenty of funds available to cover that additional gap between the 37 that we have uncommitted and the 52,000 that would be the cap without running into supplementation issues. So that's the request from Washington County. The amount that I'm recommending is not the full request, but that's limited by those supplementation issues. And so that's what I want to put to the commission now.
Thank you. And I'm just wondering, maybe in any history before I was a commissioner, I mean, is this unusual? It seems like it's a little unusual to have somebody come back and say, oh, we're in trouble. So we need more help from state.
Yeah, well, you know, a lot of people have been at this table longer than me, but I do recall there's been some amendments. There's one in Beaver County where that was more of a structural change than a request for increased funding. But there have been situations where there's been some one-time money that has been spent to help mid-year with unanticipated increases. So that happened with Utah County and some of the when they were dealing with the death penalty case and they needed some additional help. We used one-time funding to help cover that. I believe Weber County as well had some shortages that they requested one-time funding to help with as well.
Yeah.
The timing is a little unusual, but aside from that, there are other instances.
Okay, Pam, you've got your hand.
I just was confused, Matt, is the 6,000 for delinquency appeals or defense resources?
Appeals. So they are running over budget on defense resources, but they're wanting us not to pay for those defense resources overages, but for the appellate contract. And as I mentioned, that I think is more of the history of them being just over that line into the second-class county and being ineligible to have IAD take care of their appeal. So they aren't asking for the direct funding of those defense resources shortages. You know, kind of to Tom's earlier point, I think this might be, well, I'll let Tom ask his question first before I start to speak for him.
Well, can I just say, so
Sure.
I just wanted to clarify, because so it's more like they want to shift their use, because we are who does their delinquency appeals, my offices, and we haven't billed them for anything. So I just wanted to be clear, they haven't had any appeals. So it's really more that they want to shift where they're using the dollars for it, it sounds like, because I just wanted to be upfront about that, because we haven't done an appeal for them unless I missed a bill and a check, which I think I would notice.
So can I say this, Pam, you're right, it's the same thing on child welfare appeals, but I think our understanding is they want us to give more because they have a deficit in defense resources. But if we put money into their appeals, that's supplanting. So our suggestion is we would cover the additional defense resources and their budget would then be held.
No,
That's not right? Okay, excuse
But
me.
it is-
Sorry. Then how do we deal with supplementation? I forget.
Because they're going to,
They're
they're increasing their line item amount for defense resources. Going forward.
But our IDC grant funding would now be on the hook for a significant portion of the appeals. But to Pam's point, just like everything in all of our grants, if the county doesn't spend the money, we don't reimburse them for it. And so the $600,000 that would go to pay Pam's office, if there was an appeal, we would not be spending that money should Pam not do an appeal.
Okay, I apologize.
Let's see, I think, Tom, you had your hand up next.
Yeah, thank you. So would this encumber us going forward? So if we say we're going to do this, I'm assuming that each budget that we would include more funding for Washington County. It's not a one-time fix a gap thing.
It would be an ongoing type request. I mean, we would be using one-time money for this from our increase to our grant program from last fiscal year. So that 700,000 that we got, this would be part of it. It is a relatively small increase. I did the math and looking at our total grant program, this accounts, it's less than 1% of that. And as I mentioned, of that 52,000, 37,000 is from the uncommitted funding from last year.
But next year we would be on the hook for the full amount when we're putting our budget together. Is that?
Potentially. I mean, again, this is one-time funding, and whenever we increase grant funding based on one-time appropriations, we are very explicit with the county saying, you know, this is new money, this is one-time funding. A renewal is contingent upon the state increasing our ongoing funding next year.
Okay, that's
in big bold letters on the grant agreement as well, so they should be aware of that.
Okay, that's helpful to know that we have the money one time. It wouldn't be that 37 plus the other 15, I guess, to bring it to the 52. Okay.
And Commissioner Zimmerman.
Oh, I was just going to observe it's Washington County is the fastest growing county. And the idea that they just inched over the line into second class seems a little hypocritical. But I guess if you, I shouldn't stand on principle. So I guess if you think we've got the money and it isn't a promise of future revenue, I guess that's.
Conversely, you know, to that point, Commissioner Zimmerman, with there being so much growth there, it is an important area of the state to be engaged in as well. I think that thinking long-term, building that relationship with Washington County is important.
I hear you. Thank you.
Good comments.
You ready for a motion?
Well, let's see, was there, Margaret just put her hand up.
A couple of people are asking if we have a quorum, if they leave.
Oh.
What's our quorum count?
So, I think we need 7.
We have 10.
We still have 10.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we're still good then.
Drexel and Commissioner Bugden can be excused.
Yeah, we might go really fast. So Margaret, what did you want to say?
I just have one quick question, and that is, I assume that we have had no other request in regards to the uncommitted funds that we have.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're ready for a motion. Was that you, Tom?
Sure. I'll make a motion that we approve the $52,000 funding to cover the costs that were identified and as proposed by staff.
I'll second.
Second by Commissioner Zimmerman. Okay. Let's just say all in favor. Go ahead, please, and unmute and say aye.
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 All right, and if there's anyone opposed, please say nay. Okay, looks like it's unanimous for the ayes, and we do still have a good number of commissioners. So thank you for that, everyone going just a little bit past. I think that really kind of just takes us to any other business or public comment. I don't see anyone else joined in the meeting from the public. And as far as our next meeting, do we want to say when that is?
That's a good question. We otherwise would be scheduled for the third Thursday of September, but this is kind of a August, September meeting, so I think we'll probably be looking into October.
Looking at that third
Thursday of
Thursday.
October.
Okay. Okay. All right, well, if there's nothing else, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
I'll make the motion.
Everyone's jumping at it. I think Zimmerman got it. Okay, appreciate you all. Thank you so much. Have a great holiday weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, you too.
Sorry.